No one ever spoke about the cellar beneath the Harrove plantation in Tollback County, Georgia. Not after the war, not while it raged, and certainly not in the years when cotton still dominated the red clay fields. But in March of 1865, when Union soldiers finally forced their way through the rotting floorboards of the main house, they uncovered something that made even men hardened by battle step back in horror. There was a concealed chamber no larger than a horse stall, its walls covered with hundreds of small, frantic scratch marks. In one corner hung a rusted chain, fastened to nothing at all. Most disturbing of all were two sets of handprints pressed into the dried mud, one clearly belonging to an adult, the other impossibly small. Local records show that the Harrove family fled 3 weeks before Sherman's troops arrived, abandoning the plantation entirely. They were never seen again. What the soldiers found in that cellar was sealed away in military reports for 60 years, and when those documents were finally made public, 3 pages had been deliberately removed. Tonight, we are piecing together what truly happened during those 9 months before the Harroves vanished, a story of endurance, desperation, and a secret that should never have been uncovered. Before we continue with the story of the Harrove plantation, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and have hit that notification bell. We explore the darkest corners of American history that others refuse to touch. Leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Now, let's step back to where this nightmare truly began. The spring of 1864 arrived in Tollback County with an oppressive heat that made the air shimmer above the cotton fields like water over hot stones. The Harrove plantation stretched across 300 acres of Georgia red clay, modest compared to grand estates in neighboring counties, yet large enough to require 32 enslaved people to keep it operating. The main house was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch, sitting at the end of a long dirt road lined with magnolia trees that stopped blooming years earlier. Some said the trees had simply given up, like everything else in Georgia that spring, sensing the approaching collapse of a world built on suffering. Thomas Harrove ran his plantation with the cold precision of a man who viewed human beings as livestock, valuable when productive, disposable when they were not. He was 43 years old, with thinning hair and a face etched with permanent lines of suspicion and calculation. His father had built the plantation from nothing, clawing his way up from a poor white farmer to a slave owner through ruthless ambition and a willingness to commit acts that kept his neighbors at a careful distance. Thomas inherited that ambition along with the land, but not his father's cunning. The war was draining the South dry, and Thomas could feel his world crumbling beneath him, like red clay breaking apart after a hard rain. His wife, Margaret, rarely left her upstairs bedroom, her health steadily declining for what the local doctor vaguely described as nervous exhaustion. In truth, Margaret had withdrawn from a world she could no longer bear to witness. She spent her days staring out the window toward the fields, her hands trembling, her thoughts far away. The servants whispered that she had lost 3 children in infancy, that the grief had shattered something inside her that could never be mended. Thomas visited her once a week, standing stiffly in the doorway and asking if she needed anything. She never replied. The daily cruelties of plantation life were managed by the overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Cates, whose enthusiasm for brutality made even Thomas uneasy at times. Virgil was 35, unmarried, with eyes set too close together and hands that always seemed clenched into fists. He had grown up poor in the backcountry of the Carolinas, the son of a failed farmer who drank himself to death. From an early age, Virgil learned that the only way to rise in the world was to be willing to inflict pain on those beneath you. He carried a leather strap on his belt and used it freely, inventing reasons when none existed. The enslaved people on the Harrove plantation feared him more than they feared Thomas, and they had good reason to. Among them was a girl named Bess, 11 years old, small for her age, with quick hands and watchful eyes that learned early to observe everything and reveal nothing. Her skin was the color of polished walnut, her hair kept short and covered with a faded cloth. She moved through the plantation like a shadow, present yet unnoticed, which was exactly how she had survived for so long. Bess worked inside the main house, scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, hauling water from the well, and performing the countless invisible tasks that kept the Harrove household running. Her mother had been sold when Bess was 6 years old, sent to a plantation in Alabama to cover a gambling debt. Bess had screamed and clung to her mother's skirts until Virgil tore her away and locked her in the smokehouse for 2 days to teach her what he called obedience. She had no memory of her father. Ruth, the cook, claimed he'd been sold before Bess was born, but Ruth said many things, and Bess had learned never to trust anyone completely. At night, Bess slept in a narrow space beneath the kitchen stairs, a crawl space barely tall enough for her to sit upright. It was accessed through a small door most people assumed led to a storage closet. The space measured roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, with a dirt floor and rough plank walls that let cold drafts creep in during winter. She had a thin blanket, a straw pallet that smelled of mildew, and a small wooden box holding her few possessions: a smooth river stone she had found by the creek, a shard of blue glass from a broken bottle, and a scrap of fabric that had once been part of her mother's dress. It was almost nothing, but it was hers, and in a world where she owned nothing, not even herself, that mattered. It was there in that forgotten corner of the house that Bess's life intersected with a secret that would consume the next 9 months and change everything she believed about survival, loyalty, and the cost of doing what was right in a world built on doing wrong. The night it began, Bess woke to sound that did not belong. It was late April, and through the gaps in the floorboards above her head, she could hear Thomas Harrove's boots pacing back and forth across the kitchen floor, his steps sharp and restless. His voice was low and urgent, speaking to someone she couldn't see. Bess had learned to wake at the slightest unfamiliar sound. It was a survival skill, like knowing when to make herself invisible and when it was safer to speak. She pressed her ear against the narrow gap between 2 floorboards, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. "You're certain nobody saw you bring him here?" Thomas asked. There was panic in his voice, an edge Bess had never heard before. Thomas Harrove did not panic. He was always controlled, always calculating, always certain. That was Virgil Cates, came the rough, hushed reply. Found him collapsed in the North Woods, right where our property meets the Dorson land. Took a bullet to the shoulder. Fever's burning him up bad. He won't last a night without help. Maybe not even with it. "Then let him die in the woods," Thomas snapped. "Why in God's name did you bring him into my house?" His voice rose, then dropped again, careful not to wake the household. There was a pause. Bess heard the scrape of a chair dragged across the floor, the creak of someone sitting heavily. "Because he's got information," Virgil said quietly, "about Union movements. He's a Confederate scout, been operating behind enemy lines for 3 months. Says he's got intelligence that could change everything. Troop positions, supply routes, weak points in their defenses, plan for Sherman's march. But he needs time to recover, and he needs to stay hidden. Union patrols are combing these woods looking for him. They know he's wounded. They know he's somewhere close. If they find him, they'll hang him as a spy." Bess heard Thomas exhale slowly, the sound of a man weighing impossible choices. "How long?" Thomas asked. "A few weeks, maybe a month, just until he's strong enough to travel. We keep him in the cellar. Nobody needs to know. He gets his strength back, delivers his information to Confederate command, and we've done our patriotic duty. Hell, Thomas, there might even be a reward in it. Recognition. Maybe accommodations from the governor." "The cellar isn't secure," Thomas said sharply. "The slaves go down there for supplies every day. Ruth sent that girl down there 4 times a day for preserves and cornmeal." "Not the back section," Virgil replied. "Behind the preserve shelf. That old root cellar your father sealed up back in '52. Nobody's been in there for years. We open it, put him inside, seal it again. I'll handle everything. Food, water, medical supplies. You just keep running the plantation like normal. Nobody will know." Another long silence followed. Bess could almost hear Thomas thinking, measuring risk against reward. Finally, His voice came back hard and tight. "If this goes wrong, Virgil, if anyone discovers we're hiding a fugitive, Confederate or not, the Union will burn this place to the ground and hang us both. And if the Confederacy finds out we kept this information to ourselves while we nurse a spy back to health, they'll shoot us for treason." "It won't happen," Virgil said. "I'll handle everything. You have my word." "Your word?" Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Your word in Confederate dollar will buy me nothing. But I don't see that we have a choice. If this man truly has information that could help the cause, then we have a duty. God help us both." Bess heard footsteps moving toward the cellar door. She heard the slow creak of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Then there was silence. She lay in her crawl space, her mind racing as she tried to understand what she had just heard. A wounded Confederate soldier, hidden somewhere in the cellar beneath her feet. A man who would be killed if Union soldiers found him. A spy carrying secrets that might prolong the war, might keep people like her in chains for years longer. A secret Thomas Harrove was willing to risk everything to protect. She should have stayed silent. She should have pretended she'd heard nothing, gone back to sleep, and continued her invisible existence. Scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, waiting for the war to end however it would. But Bess had learned long ago that information was the only currency enslaved people possessed. Knowing things others didn't mean the difference between survival and destruction. Knowledge was power, even for a child who officially had none. There was something else, too, something she couldn't quite name. A curiosity about this wounded man, the spy hidden like contraband beneath the house. What kind of person was he? What had he seen? What secrets did he carry? And why did she feel a strange, uncomfortable kinship with someone who, by every measure, was supposed to be her enemy? The next morning, Bess went about her duties as usual. She emptied chamber pots, scrubbed the front hall with lye soap that cracked her hands until they bled, and helped prepare breakfast under Ruth's sharp, watchful eye. Ruth was a large woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and a face that revealed nothing. She ruled the kitchen with an iron spoon and a deep suspicion of everyone around her. She had lived on the Harrove plantation for 30 years, watched 3 generations of Harroves rise and decay, and learned that survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. "You're moving slow this morning," Ruth said, stirring a pot of grits. "You sick?" "No, ma'am," Bess replied. "Just tired." "Tired?" Ruth snorted. "You're 11 years old. You don't know what tired is. When I was your age, I worked the fields from sunup to sundown. You got it easy working in the house." Bess said nothing. There was no point. Ruth had her own hierarchy of suffering, and in it, field labor outweighed housework. That meant Bess had no right to complain. It didn't matter that she worked 16 hours a day, that her hands burned from lye soap, that she slept in a crawl space barely large enough for a dog. Ruth had suffered more. Therefore, Bess's suffering didn't count. "Go down to the cellar and fetch me 2 jars of preserves," Ruth ordered. "Peach, not blackberry. And don't take all day." Bess took a candle and descended the narrow stairs into the cellar. The space was low-ceilinged and damp, filled with the smells of earth, mildew, and the sharp bite of vinegar from pickled barrels. A single small window near the ceiling allowed a weak beam of morning light to spill inside, illuminating dust motes drifting in the air. Rough wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of vegetables, slabs of smoked meat hanging from hooks, sacks of cornmeal and flour, and barrels of salt pork. It was cool down there, and as Bess stepped farther inside, she felt the chill seep into her skin. Here, a brief relief from the oppressive heat above. Bess moved slowly along the shelves, her eyes searching. At the back of the cellar, hidden behind rows of preserves just as Virgil had described, she found what she was looking for, a section of wall that didn't quite belong. The boards that were newer, the nails less rusted, fitted together to seal off what had once been a doorway. Her mother, or perhaps her grandmother, she couldn't quite remember, had once told her about the old root cellar built when the house was first raised. It had been sealed after an enslaved man hid there during a punishment and was nearly forgotten, left to die before anyone realized he was missing. After that, Thomas's father had ordered the space closed forever. Bess pressed her ear against the wood and held her breath. At first, there was nothing. Then, so faint she almost missed it, she heard the sound of labored breathing. Someone was behind that wall, and they were suffering. There was a wet rattle deep in his chest, followed by a low moan of pain. The man was alive, but only just. She grabbed 2 jars of peach preserves and hurried back upstairs, her thoughts spinning. She said nothing to Ruth, nothing to anyone. But that night, lying awake in her crawl space, she couldn't stop thinking about the man sealed behind that wall. She imagined him in total darkness, wounded and alone, entirely dependent on Virgil Cates for survival. And she wondered what would happen if Virgil decided the man was more trouble than he was worth. Bess had seen Virgil killed before, a man who tried to run, caught and beaten to death as a warning to the others. Virgil had no mercy in him, no compassion. If the wounded soldier became a liability, Virgil would let him die without hesitation. 3 days passed. Bess watched Virgil closely, noting how he slipped into the main house at odd hours, always carrying something: a canteen, a bundle wrapped in cloth, a small wooden box that might have held medical supplies. He was feeding the hidden man, keeping him alive. But Virgil's face grew more troubled with each passing day. One evening, while Bess was supposed to be polishing the silver in the dining room, she overheard Virgil arguing with Thomas in the study. "He's getting worse," Virgil said, his voice tight with frustration. "The infection spreading. The wound's gone putrid. He needs a real doctor, someone who knows what they're doing. I've done what I can, but it's not enough." "Absolutely not," Thomas replied, his tone firm. "If we bring a doctor here, we might as well light a signal flare for the Union. Every physician in the county is being watched. They're looking for wounded Confederates. We bring one here, and within a day we'll have Union troops at our door." "Then what do you want me to do?" Virgil demanded. "Let him die down there?" "If necessary," Thomas said coldly. "We've done what we can. If he dies, he dies. We'll bury him in the woods, and no one will ever know he was ever here." Bess heard Virgil draw in a sharp breath. "He's got information that could save Confederate lives. You're willing to let him die for convenience." "I'm willing to protect my family and my property," Thomas snapped. "That's all that matters. The Confederacy is losing this war, Virgil. You know it. I know it. Everyone knows it, except Jefferson Davis. Sherman's marching through Georgia like a plague, burning everything in his path. The Union's going to win. And when they do, I want to be able to say I never harbored Confederate spies. I want proof of my loyalty so they don't burn my house and seize my land." "You're a coward," Virgil spat. "I'm a realist," Thomas shot back. "And if you had any sense, you'd be one too." Bess heard heavy footsteps and then the sound of the study door slamming shut as Virgil stormed out. She hurried back to the silver, her hands trembling. The wounded soldier was going to die. Thomas had made his decision, and it felt final. Except it wasn't. There was something Bess could do. That night, she made a choice that would change everything that followed. She waited until the house was silent, until even Ruth, snoring softly in her corner of the kitchen, had settled into a steady rhythm. Then Bess slipped out her crawl space, took a stub of candle and a friction match from the kitchen drawer, and crept down into the cellar. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden steps. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure it would give her away. Her hands shook as she struck the match and lit the candle. The small flame threw jumping shadows across the cellar walls, making the space feel alive. Watching her, she moved to the back, to the sealed doorway, and studied it closely. The boards were nailed in place, but carelessly. There were gaps between them, and one plank near the bottom was loose, warped by age and moisture. She set the candle down and worked at the loose board with her fingers. It took several minutes. Her fingernails cracked. Splinters bit into her skin like needles. Finally, the board came free with a soft creak that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. Behind it was darkness and the overwhelming stench of sickness. Sweat, blood, infection, human waste. The smell was so strong it made her gag. "Who's there?" A voice whispered from the darkness. It was weak, barely more than breath, but edged with fear. "Virgil, is that you?" Bess pressed her face close to the opening, careful not to breathe too deeply. "I'm not Virgil," she whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you. I brought water." She had taken a tin cup from the kitchen and filled it at the pump outside. The water was cool and clean. She passed it carefully through the gap. She heard movement. The sound of someone dragging himself across a dirt floor with agonizing slowness, until trembling fingers closed around the cup. The man drank desperately, water spilling down his chin and splashing onto the dirt. When he finally lowered the cup, his breathing was ragged and uneven. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you. God bless you. You're the Confederate scout," Bess said softly. "I heard them talking about you." There was a pause. "Who are you?" "Nobody," she replied. "Just a girl who works in the house. They don't see me. I'm invisible. You shouldn't be here. If they catch you." He broke off, coughing hard, a wet, painful sound that went on for nearly a minute. When it finally stopped, his breathing was worse than before. "They won't catch me," he said weakly. "I'm careful." Bess hesitated, then asked a question that had been burning inside her. "Are you going to die?" There was another pause, longer this time. "Probably," he said at last. "The wound's infected. I can feel it spreading through me like fire. A few more days, maybe a week." His voice was calm, almost attached, as if he were stating a simple fact rather than his own approaching end. "Resigned. I've made my peace with it," he said quietly. "I've seen enough death to know what it looks like. I just wish," his voice faltered, "I wish I could have gotten the information back to my commanders. I wish my death could have meant something." Bess thought about his words. She thought about the casual cruelty she had witnessed her entire life, the way men like Thomas Harrove and Virgil Cates treated human beings as property, as tools to be used until they broke and were thrown away. She thought of her mother, sold to a plantation in Alabama, likely dead by now from overwork, disease, or childbirth. She thought about the Union soldiers she'd heard whispered about, the ones said to be coming to free people like her, though she had learned not to trust promises from white men in uniform, no matter which side they fought for. Freedom was just a word, and words meant little when you were 11 years old and owned by someone who could sell you, beat you, or kill you on a whim. And she thought about the man behind the wall, dying slowly in the dark because Thomas Harrove valued his own safety more than another person's life. It didn't matter that the man was a Confederate soldier, that his information might prolong the war, might keep her enslaved longer. What mattered was that he was a human being, suffering and alone, and she had the power to help him. "I know about medicine," Bess said softly. "Not much, but some. Ruth taught me things. Herbs and poultices. How to clean wounds. How to bring down a fever. I could help you. I could try at least." "Why would you do that?" the man asked. His voice was confused, almost wary. "I'm a Confederate soldier. If the Union wins, people like you go free. You should want me dead. You should want the Confederacy to lose." Bess considered this carefully. It was a fair question. "Maybe," she said slowly. "Or maybe we just get different masters. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does. But I know what it's like to be trapped somewhere with no one to help you. I know what it's like to be invisible, to have people walk past you like you don't exist. And I know I can't let you die when I might be able to do something about it. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's how I feel." She heard him shift in the darkness, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of something against the dirt floor. "What's your name?" he asked. "Bess." "I'm Daniel," he said. "Daniel Pritchard, 3rd Georgia Infantry, Company B." He coughed again, though less violently this time. "If you're serious about helping me, Bess, you need to understand something. If they catch you coming down here, they'll punish you severely. Virgil Cates shows mercy to no one, especially not to enslaved people who disobey. And if they realize you know about me, they might kill you to keep the secret safe." Thomas Harrove is desperate, and desperate men do terrible things. "I know," Bess replied. "Then why risk it?" She thought about the question for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "Because I'm tired of being invisible. Because I'm tired of watching people suffer and doing nothing. Because maybe if I save one person, it means something. Maybe it means I'm not just property. Maybe it means I'm a person who can make choices, who can do something that matters. I don't know. I just know I have to try." Daniel was silent for so long that Bess wondered if he had passed out. Then very softly, he said, "You're braver than most soldiers I've known. Braver than me, certainly." Bess carefully replaced the loose board, making sure it looked untouched. She took her candle and crept back upstairs, her heart pounding with fear, and something else, something that felt almost like purpose. For the first time in her life, she was doing something that mattered, something that was her choice alone. The next night, she returned, and the night after that, and the night after that. At first she brought water, then food taken in tiny amounts from the kitchen. Pieces of cornbread wrapped in cloth, strips of dried meat, a boiled egg, a handful of pecans. Ruth noticed nothing. Bess had learned long ago how to take just enough to avoid attention. She knew which floorboards creaked, which shelves were checked most often, how to make herself invisible even when standing right in front of someone. She brought clean rags torn from an old flour sack and a jar of salve Ruth used for burns, made from lard and crushed plantain leaves that grew wild near the creek. Working by candlelight through the narrow gap in the boards, Bess cleaned Daniel's wounds as best she could. The bullet had passed cleanly through his shoulder, entering from the front and exiting the back, but both wounds were badly infected. The flesh around them was hot and swollen, oozing pus. The smell was overwhelming, but Bess forced herself not to gag. She had seen infected wounds before. They were common on the plantation, where medical care for enslaved people barely existed. She knew what to do. She packed the wounds with salve, changed the bandages, and brought him willow bark tea to bring down the fever. She had learned about willow bark from an old woman named Sarah, who had died 2 years earlier. Sarah knew the old remedies passed down from Africa, mixed with Cherokee medicine. She had taught Bess which plants could heal and which could kill, which roots eased pain and which brought on sleep. It was dangerous knowledge. Enslaved people who knew too much about medicine were often suspected of poisoning, and more than one had been hanged for it. But Sarah had trusted Bess, had seen something in her that made her willing to pass on what she knew. The work was slow and dangerous. Every night, Bess risked discovery. Every night she expected to hear Thomas Harrove's footsteps on the cellar stairs, to feel Virgil Cates's hand clamp down on her shoulder and drag her out to be punished for her disobedience. But somehow, impossibly, she remained unseen. It was as if her years of being invisible had finally become an advantage, a shield that kept her safe. Gradually, over the course of weeks, Daniel began to improve. The fever broke on the 5th night, leaving him weak and shaking but clear-headed. The infection receded slowly, the wounds beginning to close and heal. His voice grew stronger, his breathing eased, and in the darkness of the sealed root cellar, with only a narrow gap in the board between them, they talked. Daniel told her about his life before the war, a small farm in northern Georgia, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. 40 acres of rocky soil that barely produced enough to feed his family, but was his. He had bought it with money he saved working as a carpenter. A wife named Catherine, dark-haired and strong-willed, who grew up on a neighboring farm and married him when she was 16. A daughter named Emma, who would be 7 years old now, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. He told Bess about the day he enlisted, believing he was fighting to protect his home, his way of life, his right to live free from northern interference. I used to think it was about states' rights, he said one night, his voice low in the darkness. About protecting our sovereignty from northern aggression. That's what they told us. That's what the politicians said, what the preachers said, what everyone said. And I believed it. I believed I was fighting for something noble, something worth dying for. But the longer this war goes on, the more I see what it's really about. It's about keeping people like you in chains. It's about rich men protecting their wealth while poor men like me die in the mud. And I don't know how to reconcile that with the man I thought I was. Bess listened without saying much. She had learned that white people often needed to talk through their moral awakenings, to work aloud to the realization that they had been complicit in something evil. It wasn't her role to absolve him, and she didn't try. Still, she respected his honesty, even if it came too late to change anything, even if it was born of suffering rather than conviction. She told him about her own life, though there was far less to tell. Her mother's face fading from her memory like an old photograph left in the sun. The endless labor, the constant fear, the small acts of rebellion that kept her sane, stealing a moment to watch the sunset, hiding a smooth river stone in her pocket like a talisman, teaching herself to read by studying the labels on preserved jars and the occasional newspaper left lying around the house. "You can read?" Daniel asked, surprised. "How?" "I taught myself. It's illegal, but nobody pays attention to what I do. That's the advantage of being invisible. I can stand right next to someone and they don't see me. So I watch and I listen and I learn. I know which letters make which sounds. I can read most words now, though the long ones are hard." "That's remarkable," Daniel said. "Most grown men I know can't read." "It's not remarkable. It's survival. Knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you. They can sell you, beat you, work you to death. But what's in your head is yours." That's what Sarah used to say. She was the one who taught me about medicine, about plants. She said knowledge was power, even for people who had no power. She sounds wise. They sold her daughter south, and she died 6 months later. Just gave up, stopped eating, stopped talking. She just faded away. I found her one morning in her cabin. She looked peaceful, like she'd finally escaped. Daniel was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for everything." "Sorry doesn't change anything." "No," he admitted, "I suppose it doesn't." As May turned into June, Daniel's recovery continued. He could sit up now. He could move around the small space of the root cellar. Bess had managed to bring him a blanket, a bucket for waste, and a small tin plate and spoon. The space was still cramped, dark and miserable, but it was better than before. He described it to her once, about 8 feet square, with a dirt floor and stone walls that wept moisture. There was no light except what slipped through the narrow gap in the boards when Bess visited. No sound except the occasional scurry of rats. Nothing to do but sit in the dark and think and wait. "I'm going mad," he told her one night. "I can feel it. The darkness, the silence, not knowing what time it is or how long I've been here. Sometimes I think I'm already dead, that this is hell, that I'm being punished for my sins." "You're not dead and you're not in hell," Bess replied. "You're in Georgia. It's close, but not quite the same thing." He laughed, a sound that dissolved into a cough. "You have a dark sense of humor for a child." "I'm not a child. I haven't been one since I was 6 years old and watched my mother get sold away. Children get to be innocent. I never did." "No," he said softly. "I suppose you didn't." Then a new problem emerged. Virgil Kate stopped coming. Bess realized it after several nights passed without hearing Virgil's footsteps on the cellar stairs, without seeing him slip into the house at odd hours. When she asked Daniel about it, his answer was grim. "He came 3 days ago," Daniel said the union's getting too close, that it's too dangerous to keep me here. Said he'd bring food one more time, then I was on my own. Said I should be strong enough by now to break out and make my way north to Confederate lines. Daniel's voice was flat, empty. "He hasn't come back." I think Harrove ordered him to let me starve. Easier than killing me outright. Less blood on their hands. A cold fury settled in Bess's chest, familiar and almost comforting. She had felt it before, when her mother was sold, when she watched Virgil beat a man unconscious for dropping a water bucket, when Thomas Harrove sold a woman's baby to pay for a new carriage. The anger never left. It only waited. Then I'll bring you more food, she said. Enough to keep you alive. Bess, you can't, Daniel whispered. You're already taking too much risk. If they catch you, they won't. You don't know that. You're getting careless. You're coming down here every night. Someone's going to notice. Ruth will notice the missing food. Virgil will see you. And when they do, they won't punish you. They'll kill you because you know too much. And dead people don't talk. I don't care. You should care. You're 11 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. The war's going to end soon, one way or another, and you'll be free. Don't throw that away for me. Free! Bess let out a bitter laugh. You think freedom is magic? You think the war ends and suddenly everything changes? I'll still be black in a world run by white people. I'll still be poor. I'll still have nothing. Freedom doesn't change that. It's better than slavery, Daniel said quietly. Maybe it's just a different kind of prison. I don't know, but I know I'm not going to let you die. Not after everything. Even as she said it, Bess knew it was only a matter of time. Ruth was already watching her with suspicion, noticing the missing food, the way Bess was always exhausted in the mornings. And Virgil had begun to look at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, as if he sensed something was wrong, but couldn't quite see what it was yet. Figure out what? She had caught him staring at her twice now, his small eyes narrowed, his jaw working as if he were chewing on a difficult thought. The situation came to a breaking point in late June. Bess was in the kitchen preparing supper, peeling potatoes, cutting up a chicken Ruth had killed that morning, stirring a pot of beans that had been soaking since dawn. The heat was suffocating. The air was thick and unmoving, and sweat ran down her spine, soaking through her thin dress. Ruth sat at the table, kneading biscuit dough, her large hands working with the steady efficiency of long habit. Through the thin walls, Bess could hear Thomas and Virgil arguing in the study. Their voices were sharp, edged with anger. I want him gone, Thomas said. Tonight, I don't care if he's recovered or not. I don't care if he can walk. Take him into the woods and leave him there. If he dies, he dies. I won't have him on my property anymore. He can barely walk, Virgil protested. His shoulders are still weak. You're signing his death warrant. Better his death than mine. The Union's within 20 miles of here. I heard it from Patterson yesterday. They're moving through the county, searching every plantation, every farm, every house. They're looking for Confederate soldiers, for supplies, for anything they can use. If they search this house and find him, we'll all hang. Me, you, everyone. I won't risk it. He's got information. I don't care about his information. The Confederacy is losing this war. Everyone knows it. Richmond's going to fall. Lee's going to surrender. And when it's over, I want to be able to look Union soldiers in the eye and say, I never harbored Confederate fugitives. I want proof of my loyalty. You're a coward. I'm a survivor. There's a difference. Now get him out of my house tonight. That's an order. Bess's hands froze over the pot she was stirring. She had to warn Daniel, had to get him out before Virgil came for him. But how? Where could he go? He was still weak, still healing. He couldn't travel far or fast, and the woods were crawling with Union patrols. He'd be caught within a day. That night, she didn't wait for the house to fall fully asleep. As soon as Ruth retired to her corner and began snoring, Bess slipped down to the cellar, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She pried loose the board and whispered urgently into the darkness, Daniel, they're coming for you tonight. You have to leave. Now. She heard him move, heard the pain in his sharp intake of breath. I can't. he whispered back. I'm not strong enough yet. I can walk, but not far, not fast. My shoulders are still weak. If I try to run, I'll collapse within a mile. Then I'll help you. Bess, no, if they catch you helping me. I don't care. I'm not letting them kill you. Not after everything. Not after I've spent 2 months keeping you alive. She worked frantically at the remaining boards, tearing them loose one by one. Splinters drove into her palms. Her fingernails split. Blood ran down her fingers, but she didn't stop. At last, she made an opening large enough for him to crawl through. Daniel emerged slowly, painfully. In the flickering candlelight, Bess saw him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had imagined, no more than 25, with a gaunt face, hollow eyes, and a beard grown wild during his confinement. His left arm hung useless at his side, the shoulder still wrapped in her makeshift bandages. He was thin, nearly skeletal, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. He looked at her, and something like awe crossed his face. "You're just a child," he said quietly. "I'm old enough to know right from wrong," she replied. "Now come on. We don't have much time." She helped him up the cellar steps, bracing his weight as best she could. He was heavy. She was small, and every step was a struggle. They reached the kitchen just as Bess was turning toward the back door, and then she heard footsteps on the front porch. Virgil Cates. Bess made a split-second decision. She shoved Daniel toward the small crawl space beneath the stairs. "Get in there. Don't make a sound. Don't move. Don't breathe. Bess. Now." Daniel squeezed into the narrow space, his face twisting in pain as he bent his injured shoulder. Bess shut the small door just as Virgil entered the kitchen from the front hall. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep," Bess said evenly. "Came to get water." Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She walked to the bucket by the sink, dipped a cup, and drank slowly. Virgil watched her, his gaze flicking over her face, her hands, her posture, searching for any sign of a lie. At last, he grunted and moved past her toward the cellar door. Bess stood perfectly still as she heard his boots descending the steps. She heard his muttered curse when he discovered the loose boards, heard him moving around the root cellar, searching, his boots scraping over the dirt floor. When he came back up, his face was dark with rage. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and seized her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, hard enough to make her gasp. "Where is he? Where's who?" Virgil raised his hand, and Bess braced herself. She had been hit before, many times. She knew how to take it, how to turn her head, how to go limp so bones didn't break. But before the blow could fall, a voice spoke from the doorway. "Let her go." Daniel stood there, swaying slightly, his good hand gripping a kitchen knife he must have grabbed from the counter. He looked ready to collapse at any moment, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes were hard. Virgil released Bess and turned slowly. "You're in no condition to fight me, boy." "Maybe not," Daniel said evenly, "but I can make enough noise to wake the whole house. And then Thomas Hargrove will have to explain why there's a Confederate soldier hidden in his cellar." Virgil hesitated. His wife, his neighbors, the Union patrols searching the area. "Everyone will hear it," Daniel went on, "and I won't be called a deserter. That's what they'll call you when I tell them you've been hiding me for 2 months instead of reporting me. That's what the tribunal will call you before they hang you for cowardice and dereliction of duty." Daniel's voice was cold now, harder than Bess had ever heard it. "Let us go and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. No one has to know I was ever here. You can tell Harrove I escaped. Tell him I broke out on my own. He'll believe you." Virgil's jaw worked as his hands clenched and unclenched. Bess could see him calculating, weighing which choice would cause him the least trouble. At last, he stepped back. "You've got until dawn," he said. "After that, I'm reporting you to the Confederate authorities. They'll hunt you down like a dog, and when they catch you, they'll hang you Then his gaze shifted to Bess. For a moment, there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "And you," he said quietly, "you're a fool, girl. You threw away your life for a man who'll be dead in a week. Was it worth it?" "Yes," Bess replied without hesitation. "It was my choice to make. That makes it worth it." Virgil said nothing more. His boots thudded heavily across the wooden floor as he left. Bess and Daniel stood in the kitchen, the weight of what they had just done settling over them like a burial cloth. "We need to go," Daniel said. "Now, before he changes his mind." "Where?" Bess asked. "North, toward the Union lines. It's our only chance. If we reach them, we'll be safe. You'll be free and I'll figure something out." Bess thought about what she was leaving behind, the only home she had ever known, brutal as it was. She thought of Ruth, who had taught her how to cook, how to clean, how to survive. She thought of the other enslaved people on the plantation, the ones she would be abandoning. She thought of what lay ahead. Uncertainty, danger, the very real possibility of death. And then she thought of the alternative. Staying, crawling back into her hiding place, pretending the last 2 months had never happened, waiting for the day Thomas or Virgil decided she knew too much and needed to be silenced forever. "All right," she said at last. "Let's go." They slipped out the back door, moving as quickly as Daniel's weakened body allowed. The night air was thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of magnolia and honeysuckle, and something else beneath it, rain, coming soon. The moon was only a thin crescent, barely enough to see by. They reached a tree lean, when Bess heard a sound that froze her blood. Dogs barking. "They're coming after us already," Daniel said, his breathing labored. Virgil must have changed his mind. Or Thomas didn't give him a choice. Or he was lying from the start, gave us hope just to make the hunt more interesting. They pushed deeper into the woods, branches tearing at their clothes. Roots threatened to trip them at every step. Daniel was breathing hard now, his face pale in the moonlight, his injured arm pressed tight against his chest. Bess knew he couldn't keep this pace for long. His body was still weak from infection, from months trapped in darkness. He needed rest, food, time. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Behind them, the dogs grew louder, their barking sharp and frenzied. Bess could hear men shouting, could see torchlight flickering between the trees. They were being hunted. "Leave me," Daniel gasped, stumbling over a root. "You'll move faster without me. You might make it." "No," Bess said fiercely. "We started this together. We finish it together. That's how it works." They stumbled on as Bess's mind raced, grasping for anything that might save them. Then she remembered something Ruth had once told her, an old trick, passed down by people who had run, who had tried to escape and sometimes succeeded. "There's a creek about half a mile east," she said between gasps. "If we reach it and wade downstream, the water will hide our scent. The dogs won't be able to track us." It was a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. They changed direction, angling toward where Bess remembered the creek running. She had been there once, years ago, sent to fetch water when the well ran dry during a drought. It was spring-fed, cold and clear, flowing over smooth stones. If they could reach it, they had a chance. The dogs were closer now. Bess could hear them crashing through the undergrowth, hear men shouting encouragement. She risked a glance back and saw a torchlight perhaps 100 yards behind them. They reached the creek, just as the first dog burst through the brush. Bess and Daniel plunged into the water, gasping as the cold hit them. The creek was waist-deep on Bess, chest-deep on Daniel, and the current was stronger than she remembered. They began wading downstream, fighting for balance on the slick stones as the cold numbed their legs. The dog reached the bank and stopped, confused, casting back and forth for their scent. More dogs arrived. More men. Bess counted 4 torches, at least 4 men, maybe more. She and Daniel pressed themselves against the far bank beneath the shadow of an overhanging willow and held their breath. "Lost the trail," one man said, his voice carrying across the water. "Damn it," Virgil's going to have our heads. Spread out. Check both banks. They can't have gone far. That soldier's half dead, and the girl's just a child. The men move along the creek, their torches casting dancing shadows over the water. Bess and Daniel stayed perfectly still, the cold lapping at their chins, their bodies pressed into the mud. A mosquito landed on Bess's cheek and bit her, but she didn't move, didn't even blink. Daniel was shaking. From cold fear or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. After what felt like hours, those probably only minutes, the search party moved on, heading upstream instead of down. The sounds of barking and shouting faded into the distance. They waited until all they could hear was the gurgle of the creek, the chirping of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl. Then they climbed out on the far side. Their clothes were soaked and heavy, their bodies trembling with cold despite the warm night air. "We need shelter," Daniel said, his teeth chattering. "Somewhere to hide until I'm strong enough to travel properly. Somewhere they won't think to look." Bess ran through a mental map of the area. "There's an old tobacco barn about 3 miles from here," she said. "Been abandoned for years, since before I was born. The family that owned it died in a fever, and nobody wanted the land. People say it's cursed. No one goes there anymore." Daniel nodded weakly. "Can you find in the dark?" "I can," Bess said. "Think so. I've been there once, when I was little. My mother took me there to pick blackberries. They moved through the night at a slow, punishing pace, stopping often so Daniel could rest. The woods were alive around them, the rustle of small animals in the brush, night birds calling to one another, wind whispering through the leaves. Bess walked ahead, guiding them by memory and instinct, following landmarks she half remembered and half felt. A lightning-struck oak with a split trunk, a low pile of stones that might once have marked a boundary, a small clearing where wild roses grew thick and tangled. By the time the sky began to pale in the east, streaked with pink and gold, they reached the barn. It sagged with age, half its roof collapsed, its walls swallowed by creeping vines. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the windows were empty holes where glass had long ago shattered. But it was shelter. It was hidden, surrounded by overgrown fields and dense woods where no one ever came. They stumbled inside and collapsed, too exhausted to speak. The barn smelled of rot and mildew and old tobacco, but it was dry. Bess found a pile of old burlap sacks in one corner and arranged them into a rough bed. Daniel lowered himself onto it with a groan, his face gray with pain and fatigue, his injured shoulder cradled carefully. "Thank you," he whispered, already drifting toward sleep, "for everything." Bess sat with her back against the wall, keeping watch. "Don't thank me yet," she said quietly. "We're not safe, not even close." "No," Daniel murmured, "but we're alive." That's more than I expected when I woke up this morning. They slept through the day, taking turns watching through the broken windows. Bess woke every hour or so, her body trained to never sink too deeply into sleep. Each time, she checked Daniel's breathing. Each time, she listened for dogs, for shouting men, for the thunder of hooves. But the woods stayed quiet, almost peaceful, as if the world had forgotten them. When night fell again, Bess slipped out to search for food. She found wild blackberries along the edge of a field, their branches heavy with ripe fruit. She dug up edible roots, pulled wild onions, and unearthed a few small potatoes from what must once have been a garden. She filled a canteen from a nearby stream, the water cold and clear. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That became their life. For 3 weeks they stayed in the abandoned barn, hiding by day and moving only at night. Bess foraged constantly. When that wasn't enough, she stole vegetables from nearby farms. Once, she even snared a rabbit using a simple trap she'd learned by watching men on the plantation. Slowly, Daniel's strength returned. The wound in his shoulder healed, though his left arm never regained full strength. The damage was too deep, the muscle ruined, the nerve scarred beyond repair. They talked during the long hours of hiding. Daniel told her more about his life, about his wife, Catherine, dark-haired and stubborn, and their daughter, Emma, who would be 7 now. He spoke of his plans to desert for good, to make his way north and start over somewhere far from Georgia. He spoke of guilt, of the things he'd done, the orders he'd followed even when he knew they were wrong. "I shot a man once," he said one night, his voice barely louder than a breath. A Union soldier. He couldn't have been more than 18. He was wounded, lying in a ditch, calling for his mother. "I could have taken him prisoner. I should have. But my officer said we didn't have time, so we had to move. So I shot him, put a bullet in his head." He swallowed hard. I still see his face, still hear him calling for her. I'll hear it for the rest of my life. Bess listened without speaking. What could she say? The war had twisted everyone, turned ordinary people into something else. Daniel wasn't unique, just another person trying to survive in a world gone mad. She told him more about herself, about the small rebellions that had kept her sane, about teaching herself to read, about the smooth river stone she carried like a charm, about learning how to disappear in plain sight, and about her mother, the day she was sold, the way Bess had screamed and clung to her skirts until Virgil tore her away. "Do you think you'll ever see her again?" Daniel asked softly. "No," Bess said. "She's probably dead." Most people don't last long on the Alabama plantations. They work you until you drop, then replace you. That's how it works. "I'm sorry." Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back. In early August, they finally felt strong enough to move on. They traveled north by night, following the North Star, avoiding roads and towns. They crossed rivers, slipped through forests and open fields, hid from Confederate patrols and Union scouts alike. It was slow, dangerous work, but every night brought them closer. They survived on foraged food, stolen vegetables, stream water, and the quiet kindness of enslaved people who saw them passing through and left offerings where they could be found: a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, a piece of smoked ham. Those unseen hands kept them alive. Then, one night in mid-August, everything changed. They were moving through a dense pine forest, the air thick with resin and needles, when they heard voices ahead, men speaking low, metal clinking softly, the sounds of a camp settling in. Soldiers. Bess and Daniel froze. "Patrol's due back in an hour," one voice said. "If they're not here, assume they've been captured, killed, or deserted. These woods are crawling with rebs and deserters from both sides. Can't trust anyone anymore." "Captain says we move at dawn," another voice replied. "Head toward Monroe. Should be there in 3 days if nothing goes wrong." Union soldiers. They'd reached the federal lines at last. Daniel looked at Bess, hope flaring in his eyes, hope tangled with fear. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd made it this far. But what came next? What would these men do with a Confederate deserter and an enslaved child? They stepped out from the trees, slowly, hands raised. The Union soldiers spun toward them, rifles lifting in a heartbeat. For one terrible moment, Bess thought they might fire without a word. Then an officer stepped forward, a young man with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders, studying them closely as the firelight flickered across their faces. In the moonlight, "Who are you?" the officer demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Daniel Pritchard, 3rd Georgia Infantry." Daniel said steadily, "I'm deserting, and this is Bess. She saved my life. She's been traveling with me for 2 months, helping me reach your lines." The officer's gaze shifted from Daniel to Bess, taking in her torn dress, her bare feet, the exhaustion etched into her young face. "How old are you, girl?" 11, sir." Something changed in the officer's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or pity, or reluctant respect. "You've been traveling with this man alone for 2 months?" "Yes, sir. I helped him escape from the plantation where I was enslaved. We hid and moved at night, trying to reach the Union lines. He was wounded, and they were going to let him die. And I couldn't just let that happen. The officer studied her for a long moment. Then he lowered his rifle and motioned for his men to do the same. "You're safe now," he said. "Both of you. Come with us. We'll get you food, clean clothes, a place to sleep. Then we'll figure out what comes next." They were taken to a Union camp. A sprawling sea of tents, wagons, and campfires spread across a wide clearing in the woods. Bess had never seen so many soldiers in one place. Hundreds, maybe thousands, all wearing the blue uniforms of the Union Army. They were given food, real food, salt pork, hardtack, and bitter but hot coffee. They were given clean clothes, though the smallest uniform they could find still hung off Bess like a sack. They were given a tent to share, with real blankets and a canvas floor that kept out the damp. Bess was questioned at length about the Harrove plantation, its location, its layout, its defenses, the number of enslaved people there, and where Thomas Harrove kept his valuables. She answered as best she could, though a strange guilt settled in her chest as she spoke. It made no sense. The plantation had been her prison, and the Harroves had never shown her loyalty or kindness. And yet it was the only home she had ever known, and there was something unsettling about giving strangers the information they needed to destroy it. Daniel was questioned as well about Confederate troop movements and the intelligence he had been carrying when he was wounded. He told them what he knew, but made it clear he wanted no part in the war anymore. The Union officers seemed to accept this, though Bess noticed he was kept under guard, as if they didn't fully trust him. 3 days later, a Union regiment moved on the Harrove plantation. Bess wasn't there to see it, but she heard what happened from soldiers returning to camp. Thomas Harrove had fled before they arrived, taking his wife and whatever valuables they could fit into a single wagon. They headed west toward Alabama, and no one knew what became of them. Virgil Cates had tried to fight, barricading himself inside the main house with a rifle. When he refused to surrender, Union soldiers shot him. He died on the front porch, bleeding out as the house burned behind him. The enslaved people were freed, though Bess soon learned that freedom often meant being herded into contraband camps. Those camps were overcrowded and disease-ridden, with too little food and inadequate shelter. People died there by the dozens, from typhoid, from dysentery, from simple starvation. Freedom, it turned out, was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Bess asked about Ruth, about the others she had known, but no one could tell her what had happened to them. They had scattered into the chaos of a collapsing South, searching for family members sold away years earlier, trying to build new lives from nothing. Daniel left the camp in September, heading north toward Pennsylvania, where he hoped to find work and eventually send for his family. When he said goodbye to Bess, there were tears in his eyes. He pressed a small carved wooden bird into her hand, something he had made during their weeks in the barn, whittled from a piece of oak with a borrowed knife. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick. "I'll never forget that. You're the bravest person I've ever met, and I've met a lot of brave people. If I ever have another daughter, I'm going to name her Bess. In your honor, what will you do?" Bess asked, turning the bird over in her hands. It was beautifully made, its wings delicate, each feather carved with care. "Try to be a better man than I was," Daniel said. "Try to make something good out of all this suffering. Try to teach my daughter that all people are equal, that slavery was a sin, that we were wrong. I don't know if it'll be enough, but it's all I can do." He studied her for a moment. "And you? What will you do?" Bess looked around the camp, at the soldiers, the freed people, the confusion and uncertainty of a nation tearing itself apart. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'll figure it out. I always do." She never saw Daniel again. Years later, she heard that he had made it to Pennsylvania, reunited with his family, and lived a quiet life as a carpenter until his death in 1889. She heard that he had another daughter, born in 1867, and that he named her Elizabeth, Bess for short. She didn't know if it was true, but she hoped it was. Hoped he'd found peace. Hoped he'd kept his promise to be a better man. As for Bess, She stayed with the Union Army as it moved through Georgia, working as a laundress and cook. The work was hard, but no harder than what she'd done on the plantation. And now she was paid. Only a few dollars a month, barely enough to survive on, but it was hers. She saved every penny, hiding the coins in a small cloth bag tied around her waist. When the war ended in 1865, she made her way to Atlanta, where she found work in a boarding house run by a free black woman named Hannah. Hannah was in her 40s, stern but fair, and she took Bess under her wing. She taught her how to run a household, how to manage money, how to survive in the dangerous and complicated world of Reconstruction. Bess learned to read and write properly, studying by candlelight after her work was done. She learned arithmetic, keeping the boarding house's books and balancing accounts. She learned how to deal with white people who still saw her as property, how to stand her ground without getting herself killed. In 1870, at 17 years old, Bess opened her own boarding house using the money she had saved and a loan from Hannah. It was small, just 6 rooms, but it was hers. The story that unfolded in that cellar was one of courage, compassion, and quiet defiance by a child in a world built on cruelty. Bess's actions rippled through time. She saved Daniel's life, gave him a chance to change, and inspired generations through her example of bravery. Although much of her life was lost to history, there were no photographs, letters, or official records, her legacy remained in the lives of those she touched, in the boarding house she ran, in the words carved into the hidden door of the cellar, and in the memory preserved in Daniel's journal. The Harrove plantation itself became a ghost of the past. The main house burned under mysterious circumstances in 1866 and was never rebuilt. The land was eventually subdivided into small farms and absorbed into the growing suburbs of the 20th century. The cellar, where Daniel had hidden, was filled in and forgotten, buried beneath layers of dirt and time until 1925, when a construction crew breaking ground for a new house discovered the sealed root cellar. They found the scratches on the walls, hundreds of them, tiny marks that might have been Daniel counting the days of his confinement. They found a rusted chain, though nobody could explain what it had been attached to or why it was there. They found something else as well, a small wooden door, barely large enough for a child, hidden behind a false wall, and carved into the wood in letters so small they were almost invisible were 2 words: Bess helped. The discovery made the local newspapers, sparking speculation about what had happened in that cellar 60 years earlier. By that time, everyone who might have known the truth was gone. Thomas and Margaret Harrove had disappeared into Alabama and were never heard from again. Virgil Cates was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the plantation grounds. The enslaved people who had lived there had scattered to the winds, their stories lost to history. The story became a local legend, whispered about but never confirmed, a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. People speculated. Perhaps it had been a hiding place for runaway slaves. Perhaps it had been where the Harroves kept prisoners. Perhaps it was something darker, something involving murder or torture or unspeakable crimes. The truth, as is often the case, was both simpler and more complicated than any of the legends. It was not until 1931, when a historian researching Union military records stumbled across a report filed by Lieutenant James Morrison in August 1864, that pieces of the puzzle began to come together. The report mentioned a young enslaved girl who had helped a Confederate deserter escape, who had provided valuable intelligence about plantation defenses, and who had shown remarkable courage and resourcefulness. The report did not give her name, merely referring to her as a Negro child, approximately 11 years of age. The historian attempted to trace further information, but the trail went cold. There were no photographs of Bess, no letters, no official records of her life after the war. There was only that one report, the carved words on the cellar door, and the memories of a few elderly people in Atlanta who remembered a boarding house owner telling them about hiding a wounded soldier when she was a child. The story might have ended there, forgotten again, if not for one final discovery. In 1958, a woman named Sarah Pritchard, researching her family genealogy, found a journal that had belonged to her great-grandfather, Daniel Pritchard. In it, He had written extensively about his time in Georgia during the war, about the plantation where he had hidden, and about the young girl who had saved his life at tremendous risk to her own. The journal entries were detailed, almost obsessive, as if Daniel had been trying to preserve every memory, every conversation, every moment of those 9 months. He wrote about Bess's courage, her intelligence, and her determination to save him, even when it made no logical sense. He wrote about the guilt he felt knowing that she had risked everything for him, while he had spent years fighting to keep people like her enslaved. "I have lived 40 years since that night," he wrote in an entry dated 1904, a year after Bess's death, though he did not know she had died. "I have built a life, raised children, tried to be a good man, but I have never forgotten the courage of that child who had every reason to let me die and chose instead to save me. I pray that she found peace and happiness, that the war gave her the freedom she deserved. I pray that somewhere, somehow, she knows that her kindness mattered, that it changed everything, that it changed me." He wrote about naming his second daughter Elizabeth, telling her the story of the girl who had saved his life, and teaching all his children that slavery was evil and that they had a responsibility to fight for justice and equality. He wrote about the nightmares he still had, about the man he had shot in the ditch, and about all the things he had done in the war that he could never take back. And he wrote about how Bess had shown him that even in the darkest times, even when the world seemed determined to crush every bit of humanity out of people, there were still those who chose compassion over cruelty, who chose to help even when it cost them everything. Sarah Pritchard published excerpts from the journal in a small historical society newsletter in 1959. It was picked up by a few newspapers, and eventually someone in Atlanta made the connection to the boarding house owner who had died in 1903. The pieces finally came together, and the full story of Bess and Daniel emerged from the shadows of history. What had happened in that cellar beneath the Harrove plantation was a story of courage, survival, and humanity, a testament to the idea that even in the darkest times, one act of kindness can change the course of life and leave a legacy that endures for generations. Exactly what the evidence suggested. An act of extraordinary courage by a child who had no reason to risk everything for a stranger, and yet she did it anyway. There was no supernatural element, no divine intervention, no fairy tale ending. Just two people trying to survive in a world that wanted them dead, choosing to help each other when they had every reason not to. The story raises questions that have no easy answers. What drives a child to risk her life for someone who, by all logic, should have been her enemy? What makes a man question everything he has believed and fought for? How do we measure the value of a single act of kindness in the midst of a war that killed hundreds of thousands? What does freedom really mean, and is it ever enough? We do not have definitive answers. We only have the facts. The cellar, the handprints, the carved words, the journal entries, the boarding house that became a school. We have the evidence of two lives that intersected for 9 months in 1864 and were forever changed by that intersection. The Harrove plantation is gone now, the land covered by suburban houses, shopping centers, and the relentless march of progress. But if you know where to look, you can still find the old foundation, still see the outline of where the cellar once stood. And if you are very quiet, if you let yourself imagine what happened there all those years ago, you can almost hear the whisper of two voices in the darkness, a wounded soldier and a child who refused to let him die, making a choice that would echo through generations. That is the real horror of this story, is it not? Not ghosts or demons or supernatural evil, but the simple, terrible fact that a child had to risk her life to save someone. That the world was so broken that an act of basic human decency became an act of extraordinary courage. That is a nightmare that should keep us awake at night. Not the thought of what might be lurking in the dark, but the memory of what we have done to each other in the light of day. The cellar door is gone now, torn down and destroyed decades ago. But the words carved into it, Bess helped, remain in photographs taken by the construction crew in 1925, preserved in the archives of the Talbot County Historical Society. Two words that tell a story of courage, compassion, and the choice to do what is right, even when the cost is almost unbearable. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is all we can ask for. That someone somewhere remembers that the story does not die, that Bess's choice, made in a cellar in Georgia in 1864, continues to matter more than a century later. Because in the end, that is all any of us can hope for, that our choices matter, that our actions have meaning, that the things we do in the darkness will someday be brought into the light. This story shows us that the most terrifying horrors are often the ones we inflict on each other, and that the most powerful acts of resistance are sometimes the smallest. A child bringing water to a dying man, a decision to help when every instinct says to look away. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed, or are there still secrets buried in that Georgia red clay? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. See you in the next story.